Evening, peoples, and welcome back to my living room with me and Gingersnap here for our summer Bible study series, very loosely faith and fiction, fun things that I wanted to talk about because they're interesting. So tonight we are talking about something that may very well have been selected by Gingersnap herself because we are talking about birds. So I've got my bird skirt here. And we have two bird guests. This is Yoshi, a penguin that I've had since I was 9. He had a 21st birthday party a few years ago, as you do. And this is, I stole one of Gingersnap's birds. This is a red cardinal that if you press it, it's a very exciting toy. Anyway, birds. So there are a lot of birds in the Bible. There's a lot of things in the Bible. It's kind of a large book. But anyway, birds come in and out. In particular, all the birds of the air is kind of a stand-in phrase for like a third of all of creation. Along with all of the animals of the earth and the fish of the seas. The fish of the seas is also a stand-in phrase for every life form that lives in the water. So all of the birds in the air encompasses a lot of things and is a phrase that comes up rather a lot. For example, it's used this way in Ezekiel 17:34, when God says, "On the mountain height of Israel I will plant a sprig, in order that it may produce boughs and bear fruit, and become a noble cedar. Under it every kind of bird will live. In the shade of its branches will nest winged creatures of every kind." So it's a very expansive idea of all kinds of animals will find peace with this tree. So we read a bunch of little bits of Job last week with the cat fur and my lipstick. Which is not in Job. Of course, we've got a unicorn or dragon and sea monsters and leviathans and behemoth and all sorts of fun things in Job, but also some like normal animals. So in Job 12, verses 7 through 9, we have, "But ask the animals, and they will teach you. The birds of the air, and they will tell you. Ask the plants of the earth, and they will teach you. And the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this?" So in general, birds in Christian art, because birds other than Yoshi here can fly, and I guess other than chickens like she just had for dinner, but birds, the ones that fly, in general in Christian art, they might allude to spiritual aspirations, because birds can fly high enough to see the earth in a kind of a different perspective than humans can. So it's a bit literal that they can fly up, maybe get closer to God. I mean, God is everywhere, but in terms of like artistic representations, God is generally up. So in the book of Job, which as we saw last week, it's full of fantastical animals, but it also has plenty of more mundane animals in its imagery. So in one of its many rhetorical questions, Job is just chock full of rhetorical questions. Job is advised to talk to birds and ask them to help him understand the magnitude of God's creation, which is just kind of neat. It's not so much as like, I don't want to talk to you, you should go talk to some birds instead. It's more of like, look around you, look at all of the things that exist. God made all of those things. God is huge. So in Psalm 84, because of course there's plenty of birds in the Psalms, verses 1 through 4, we read, "How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul longs, indeed it faints, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh sing for joy to the living God. Even the sparrow finds a home, and the swallow a nest for herself, where she may lay her young at your altars, O Lord of hosts, my King and my God. Happy are those who live in your house, ever singing your praise." So on one hand, I love the idea of a wild animal making a comfortable home at the altar of God and just building a nest in God's house. And that's kind of delightful. And then I remembered that in the context of Psalms, birds might be getting sacrificed on the altar, and that kind of killed this nice little image for me. I don't know if sparrows and swallows specifically were sacrificed. This is not exactly my wheelhouse. So that kind of, but still, the idea of having a home or a nest in the altar of God is really nice. So in Christian art, the sparrow is understood to be the lowliest among all birds. I am not an expert in birds or ornithology, although I do know the word ornithology, so I want partial credit for that. I don't know why the sparrow was considered the lowliest among all birds, but that kind of makes it a stand-in for the least of these. And even the least of these are loved by God. There's a whole bit in Matthew 25 that I just love about whatsoever you did for the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. So even these measly little sparrows, God loves them too for some reason, even though they are the lowliest amongst all birds. Do you have an opinion about sparrows? Meow? Okay. So also the swallow is tied to the incarnation in art. So it sometimes will come up in images of the Annunciation, the angel Gabriel coming to Mary, or the Nativity, Jesus being born. So we used to think that the swallow hibernated all winter and then returned in the spring. So it's kind of the stand-in for the resurrection or returning to life after the winter of death. Medieval creativity is all I can say. So in Song of Songs 2:12, we read, and I love Song of Songs so much, "The flowers appear on the earth, the time of singing has come, and the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land." So obviously the dove represents peace, which is why it shows up a whole lot on Christmas cards. I got one maybe last year that had a very sparkly dove with a little sprig of holly in its mouth and said something about peace. It was very pretty. So yeah, peace, or also purity, because doves are white and it's not the most creative jump to get to purity, from not the point. Anyway, so the dove is, peace and purity and nice things. So for that reason, doves will often hang out with Mary, the mother of Jesus. So if there's a single dove on its own, especially if it's kind of like a focal point of a piece of art, or over somebody's head, it stands for the Holy Spirit. If there's one dove, if there are 7 doves, this is 7 in sign language, they might represent the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, which gets very abstract. So in Isaiah 34, 9 through 12, great bits of imagery here. "And the streams of Edom shall be turned into pitch, and her soil into sulfur. Her land shall become burning pitch. Night and day it shall not be quenched. Its smoke shall go up forever. From generation to generation it shall lie waste. No one shall pass through it forever and ever. But the hawk and the hedgehog shall possess it. The owl and the raven shall live in it. He shall stretch the line of confusion over it, and the plummet of chaos over its nobles. They shall name it, No Kingdom There, and all its princes shall be nothing." Such great imagery. They shall name it, No Kingdom There. Yeah, the cat furs just get everywhere, including my eyelashes. Very annoying. So this is this great image of just desolation and a society, its legacy being burning pitch and smoke that never stops smoking. So here are some bad birds, I guess you could say, in terms of art. So the owl, the owl can mean a number of things. So because owls are seen as loners, they might represent solitude. So maybe they hang out with a hermit in a painting. A lot of times there's so many saints in history that it's kind of hard to keep track of them. So if you see a guy with an owl, then that might clue you in. Okay, well, we can narrow it down from male saints to male saints who were hermits. So there's a start there. But owls might also represent wisdom. I've never quite understood why owls are associated with being smart, but they are. The point is they are. So they might hang out with a particular saint who was a scholar. In particular, Saint Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin, like by himself, which is pretty impressive. Like, there are some translation issues within the Latin Vulgate Bible, to put it mildly, but one dude translated the entire Bible into Latin. That's very impressive, like, regardless of the amount of translation mistakes or creative things ended up in there. It's pretty impressive. Definitely not something I could do, for sure. So owls also kind of play with an imagery of light and dark because they're nocturnal. So sometimes in a painting you'll see owls hanging out with Jesus because Jesus came to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death. So that's kind of neat, like turning things over on their heads. So the raven also is a bad bird because in this just stunning bit of creativity, ravens in art represent the darkness of the soul because they have black feathers. But also, for the same reason, blackbirds are a visual representation of sin because they have black feathers. Which, okay, sure, whatever. I mean, sure. So in the medieval imagination, ravens would eat the eyes and the brains, specifically, of the dead, which I like to think is something that Edgar Allan Poe read in a book once, and this fact just, like, spoke to him on a deep spiritual level, and then ravens just became, like, his Patronus. Anyway, ravens are cool. Ravens are very smart. They deserve better than to be seen as bad birds who represent chaos and sin. And come on up here, Gingersnap. We're talking about birds. I thought you would be invested in this. Anyway, so a bit of reading from the New Testament in Matthew 26. This is a pretty familiar bit of bird imagery. Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." Peter said to him, "Even though I must die with you, I will not deny you." And so said all the disciples. So the rooster, because it wakes up early, might represent watchfulness or vigilance, but more likely, obviously, if the rooster is hanging out with Peter, it's not a watchful, vigilant bird. It's a bird that represents denial. Maybe in a slightly more hopeful painting, it also represents ultimate redemption after denial. I don't know, I guess the early bird gets the worm, but the bird who gets a little too close to a certain disciple gets a bad reputation instead. So another classic bird, the eagle. As we read in Isaiah 40:31, "But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." So the eagle is specifically associated with the Gospel of John. So in many churches of a certain era, there might be eagles carved on the lectern or the pulpit, more often the lectern. Each of the Gospels has like imagery that goes with it, and the eagle is connected to John. So there was a point when we thought that eagles worked a bit like phoenixes. So phoenixes, when they reach the end of one lifetime, they burst into flame and then poof, look, it's a baby phoenix now. So we used to think that eagles would fly close to the sun and then dive underwater, and they'd come up and bam, they've got new feathers. Again, I am not an ornithologist, so, but I'm pretty sure that's not how eagles work. But there was a point when we thought that was how eagles worked. So, sure, why not? Anyway, point being, there's kind of a resurrection theme there, that they can be renewed in after kind of being baptized, which is, it's a neat bit of imagery. It's kind of weird, but it's neat imagery of rebirth after baptism. But also eagles are just like they're strong and impressive and big with the wings. So there's a general connection between eagles and people who were just or courageous or particularly virtuous in some way. So a few other miscellaneous birds. There's some really fun ones here. So the crane might represent vigilance and loyalty, especially if they're painted with monks, because the medievals thought, and this is delightful, that there was a king of the cranes. And so at night, all of the cranes would like gather around in a circle around the king crane, and they would take turns being on guard duty. So the cranes who are on guard duty are standing on one leg to keep themselves awake, which, sure, I mean, I like that image. That, yeah, why not? I'm pretty sure that's not why they stand on one leg, but okay. So if there's eggs in art, they represent hope and resurrection. That one's fairly straightforward. You don't have to be a weird medieval person with no understanding of how science actually works to get to that one. So the falcon is another interesting one where there's some very different understandings. So if you have a wild falcon in art, then it is evil. If you have a domesticated falcon, and I don't really know how you tell the difference between a wild falcon and a domesticated falcon, like, unless it's like on a falcon glove, whatever. But anyway, a domesticated falcon might represent a Gentile who's been converted to Christianity. It's kind of cool. So the goldfinch eats thistles and thorns. So it might hang out with baby Jesus, which kind of represents that there will be thorns in his future. So the goldfinch foreshadows the crown of thorns. I really like that one. I just learned that one today. Although, to be fair, again, I'm not a bird expert, so I'm not sure I would... Okay, I know that I would not identify a goldfinch if I saw one. Maybe I should learn a bit more about it. Anyway, so the peacock, which is one of my top 3 least favorite birds. Peacocks they're pretty. I don't know if you've met one in person, but they have this really loud, obnoxious scream. And they're just really dumb, and they will run into things and break them. And they broke a huge glass window near where I grew up at one point. And they searched the world over and couldn't find anyone who could make glass in the size they needed. So instead of one big glass window, it became 3 glass windows. Anyway, peacocks are just so loud and obnoxious. They may be pretty. It's not worth it. I don't want to hear them. Anyway, top 3 least favorite birds. Also pigeons and Canada geese, if you were wondering. So we used to think, this is another very fun understanding of birds. We used to think that the flesh of a peacock would never decay. I don't know why we thought that, but we did. But for that reason, the peacock is like immortality, sure. But it's also got a bunch of eyes on its tail, which has a really interesting Greek origin myth around it too. But in Christian art, the 100 eyes on the tail might say something about the all-seeing eyes of God, or the all-seeing presence of the church. Of course, depending on the context, a peacock might also represent vanity, because they are very pretty birds. Yeah, but they're very show-offy. Oh, very, very show-offy. So, I have saved the best bird for last. And it is the pelican. So, yes, the pelican. Meow indeed. Thank you. So, we used to think that a mother pelican would beak her own breast in order to feed her own blood to her babies. This is not how pelicans work, but we used to think that it was. because if you're seeing a seabird in the distance and it's kind of like doing some kind of, that's my bird impersonation, really they're plucking feathers, but it was this idea that they were feeding their own blood to their babies, which is a pretty intense image of self-sacrifice. So that kind of connects the pelican to Jesus on the cross. So there's a surprisingly large amount of pelicans in churches of a certain era. So sometimes there will be a pelican hanging out with Jesus in a crucifixion scene, or even like perched on top of the cross, or just on top of a church, like the roof of a church, which is pretty neat. So this is a really strange leap of ornithological understanding, but it's really neat symbolism. So yay for pelicans. I did grow up near the ocean. It never occurred to me that pelicans were feeding their blood to their babies, because they don't, and that would be weird. But we used to think that, and so it's this great image of self-sacrifice. I did a bit of studying in college about Christian art and all of the imagery behind it. And it used to be one of my favorite hobbies when I was studying abroad to read the stained glass windows in churches and figure out what Bible scene they were depicting, or concept, or saints, etc. And it's really fun. It's kind of like this secret code language if you really get into it. Yeah. So anyway, birds. I wanted to talk about birds today because I wanted to really include my cat and use props. If I had my life together more this afternoon, I would have included some images, but I was very busy working on the YouTube page, so there weren't other birds other than the penguin and the cardinal. Anyway, so that was a bit of a fun exploration into some birds in the Bible and birds in art. So I hope it inspires you to go out bird watching if and when it stops raining, which of course is one of Gingersnap's very favorite hobbies, and she hopes that others can partake in it as well, because it is just prime entertainment. Anyway, good night, peoples, from me and Gingersnap. Until we see you again. And as a very important heads up, next week, July 20th, is the feast day of my favorite saint. And so we will be talking about her next week. So until then, good night.